Welcome, everyone. I'm Karen Yargimilo. I'm the Dean of SIPA, the Adlai Stevenson Professor of International Relations. Thank you for being with us today. The subject of today's fireside chat is one that honestly I wish we didn't have to do, but we absolutely must. The Council on American Islamic Relations reports that anti-Muslim incidents are at their highest level in nearly 3 decades. Complaints of anti-Muslim bias were 56% higher in 2023 than the previous year. Just think about those numbers. And I think for the 2024 numbers are even higher. On campus, I know we have Muslim students who feel vulnerable and even afraid to show their identity in public for fear of being subject to harassment and attacks, whether online or in person. We've heard horrific stories. I've personally heard horrific stories of Muslim students being the victims of doxing and physical attacks. And as you can imagine, after October 7, you've seen an even further rise in those incidents, including on our campus. This is why last fall we created the SIPA anti-hate task force to stamp out all forms of hate speech at our school to ensure that everyone, regardless of their religion or creed, feels safe and secure and empowered to speak their mind and to strengthen the resilience of the SIPA community. No less is at stake than the future of our democracy. After all kind of intolerance, when targeted at religious, ethnic, or other minority groups, are significant and worrisome signs that challenges the very foundations of what it means to be a liberal, democratic society. As we heard in February from the historian and U.S. Special Envoy Deborah Lipstadt, spikes in the incidence of anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim hate, and other hate crimes are often early warning signs of democratic backsliding. And the trend is true in the United States. We see this trend across the globe. And it's one of the things that we are here studying at SIPA and working really, really hard to understand the patterns, to collect data, to understand what is driving this and what is the most useful ways of combating hate. Before I introduce today's featured speaker, I want to first thank Reverend Ian Rottenberg. Ian is here, who directs Columbia's Earl Hall Center for Religious Life, and is our co-sponsor of today's discussion. Thank you, Ian, so much for your leadership and for making today's event possible. It is really an honor to work with you and the work that you've been doing. And I know that this is, again, a part of a series that we will continue to work on together. We are fortunate, very fortunate, to have Farah Pandith joining us today. She was appointed as the first ever special representative to Muslim communities in June 2009. She's also an adjunct senior fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations, a foreign policy strategist, and a former diplomat. Thank you so much, Farah, for being with us today. Farah will be joined on stage by Kian Tajbakhsh, who will moderate today's discussion. Kian is a professor of urban policy at SIPA, as well as a lecturer and presidential fellow with the Committee on Global Thought. Thank you, Kian, for doing this. Now, please join me in welcoming Farah and Kian. Thank you very much.
Well, Karen, thank you very much for that nice introduction. And I'd like to welcome Farah Pandith to SIPA, and it is an honor to be with you today. Let's start off by telling us a little bit about yourself. As your experience as the special representative to Muslim communities, what is the role and the work of that office?
Well, first of all, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you so very much for that very kind introduction and for the invitation to come. I went to Fletcher, I have to just put it out there, but I'm really happy to be here at SIPA. I'm really impressed with the program that you are deploying that's even more energetic and important. And I really want to thank you for taking the lead on this, especially the work that you're doing on women in foreign policy. I think that's essential. That is a good segue to your question. I was working in government before the Obama administration in the White House at the National Security Council during the time of 9/11. And it was in the George W. Bush administration where we were trying to figure out what we could do to bridge the gap between what we thought we needed to do to stop extremist ideology and what was really practical and on the ground. We had all kinds of hard power ideas and we executed thinking that in order to deal with Al-Qaeda and the threat that they posed in radicalizing and recruiting people, that would be the way to go about it. And it became very clear by 2003 or so that you can't stop somebody from finding the ideology of Al-Qaeda appealing if in fact you don't have some soft power tools that you are using. In the Bush administration, I began to experiment with our team on ways to do this groundbreaking work, looking at the ideological component of the fight that we were dealing with. And the way to do that was to talk with people on the ground, to get to know what was happening. At that time, it was millennial Muslims, what was really going on, what ideas did they have on how to build resilience in their communities, how to debunk the us versus them ideology and narratives that were going out. When we began to experiment and pilot an approach, a soft power approach in Europe, and we can talk more about that if you want, but this leads us to the Obama administration. From 2007 to 2009, I was working in the Europe Bureau at the State Department. I went across 55 cities and 19 countries in Europe over the course of 2 years. And my job was to listen to what young Muslims were thinking and experiencing from Norway to Sicily. And to understand what we could do as the US government to be the convener and the facilitator and the intellectual partner with the ideas that we heard on the ground. NGOs who had ideas on how to build resilience and how to put forward a different mindset about what it meant to be Muslim on the planet, rather than having an extremist organization say this is what it means to be a Muslim. And we were very successful in building a model that no other country in the world had. When Obama became president, he appointed Secretary Clinton to be Secretary of State. And in that role, very early on, she had asked, it was January 2009, she asked all the regional bureaus to give her a briefing on what was going on. And what's interesting here, because she's part of the SIPA world, I think it is an important thing to sort of call out because it's, in my view, very rare. She had a 1-hour meeting with the regional bureau in Europe, and she brought people to the table. We all knew that she was going to have more time to talk about different things, but we were really excited to have the new Secretary of State in January 2009, and I was on my way out. I had another job lined up for life after the Bush administration. And we started the meeting, and for 45 minutes, people were talking about NATO and the gas pipeline and Russia and other things that were happening in Europe. Secretary Clinton, in 45 minutes, stopped the meeting, and she said, you know what, I'm going to have a chance to hear from all of you in greater detail, but I want to make sure that everybody that's sitting around this table has a chance to speak. And she looked over at me and she said, why are you here? And I said, Madam Secretary, and then I just explained what I just explained to you, what I was doing in the Bush administration, how important Muslims were under the age of 30, how we had to do a better job of listening to what they were saying, as opposed to taking others, listening to what others said that they are doing. And the more I spoke, the more she was doing this. And she was leaning in and she was asking important questions. How did they respond to the US government doing this? When you talk to Muslims in France or Muslims in Sweden or Muslims in Italy, how did they respond? What were their ideas? What more should we be doing? And the more we talked, the more engaged we became. And my boss was sitting next to her and he says, when Farah leaves, because I was about to leave, she puts her hand on Dan's arm, she pushes him back and she leans at me and goes, where are you going? And my heart stopped, obviously. But then I told her where I was going and she said, we will see about that. Now, I'm telling you this story because her understanding of how important it was to talk to young people under the age of 30, to listen to what they had to say, as opposed to us as policymakers deciding what was taking place in the world, is the premise for the role of special representative to Muslim communities. That role was taking my experimental job in Europe and doing it around the world. And what we did is we built a program with our embassies around the world where we were engaging with young people under the age of 30, whether you were in a Muslim majority country or you were a Muslim living as a minority, and listening to ideas about building strong communities. This wasn't just about the ideology of extremism. It was also about entrepreneurship and social impact. It was also about finding ways for us as the US government to look at 1/4 of the planet. That's just a data point I want to just make sure we're all understanding. 1/4 of the planet is Muslim. And there are more than 1 billion Muslims under the age of 30. If you are a US foreign policymaker, you need to understand what is happening to that demographic. And what this job did, it was an opportunity for us to execute a very focused approach on building relationships with Muslims all over the world, acting as the convener, the facilitator, and the intellectual partner with the ideas that we heard on the ground. And what did that job result in? It wasn't about Farah. It was about the teams of people across the world who were understanding at embassies, hey, we can do things better. Did we listen to that young person over there? Did we do all that we could to build and connect the dots? And that's a really vital piece of the job. The success model was not that we were just listening. That's not enough. We were able to say that idea that I just heard in Oslo, Norway, connects to the idea that I just heard in Nouakchott, Mauritania. And we were able to connect those young people together. And so we built networks of like-minded thinkers all over the world who were social entrepreneurs and activists and people who were engaged in building a different kind of world and debunking the idea of an us versus them. So we built almost 15 or 20 different kinds of networks and initiatives through the leadership of Secretary Clinton and then Secretary Kerry. That office was responsible specifically for Muslims, but we obviously engaged with different parts of the department so that we could find ways that young people, this is really a young people's program, to think about the future of the world, how we want to be placed in it, and the opportunities for the US government to find ways to listen in new ways. So that's what that job was.
Excellent. Well, that's a great segue into really the other side. I mean, the listening side.
Forgive me. Thank you.
So far, what did you find when you listened? What were the different perspectives you encountered about being Muslim in the world today? And what did you learn from how different generations of Muslims see their future? Are they hopeful, importantly, and how do they see the West?
I love this question. A couple of things I want to just state because I think it's important when you hear my answer. First, I'm an American Muslim. I was born in India. I came to this country when I was 1.5. I grew up outside of Boston in Massachusetts. I also am somebody who is speaking for herself today. I wear a lot of hats. I want you to know this is me, Farah, speaking. So when you ask that question, here's what was surprising to me. When I was doing that Europe job, here's what I heard all the time. I kept hearing in a post 9/11 world, millennial Muslims telling me that they didn't know who they were. They were hearing the loud, very loud headlines, literal headlines and social media headlines about who they were. And they were asking, what's the difference between culture and religion? What is Islam? How am I supposed to activate and be me? Now, I thought this question about identity and belonging was because they were living as minorities in Europe. That's what I thought. Here's what I found out. As special representative to Muslim communities, I traveled to nearly 100 countries. And no matter where I went, Muslim majority countries or Muslims living as minorities, that question about identity and belonging was consistent. And it freaked me out. I couldn't understand it. I'm in Pakistan, I'm in Malaysia, I'm in, Morocco, I'm in pick your Muslim majority country. And it wasn't the fact that they were in a Muslim majority country, it was the fact that they were millennials growing up in a post 9/11 world. So my headline today is that you all know how important identity and belonging is. Everybody navigates identity and belonging growing up. It doesn't matter if you're Muslim or not. That's what you do. You ask questions about who am I? What is my role in the world? I still ask that question. We still do these things. But for me, it was remarkable that 9/11 moment had somehow switched something really crazily. And it made me think about, well, what does a young person do if they have a question about who they are or what Islam is? In earlier generations, you might go to your mom and dad. You might go to your granddad or grandmom, auntie, uncle, cousin, and say, why do we do this? What's the difference between culture and religion? I mean, which part of this is heritage versus what's supposed to happen here within the religious scripture? But that's not what was happening to these young people. These young people were not going to their mom and dads. They weren't going to their aunties and uncles. They were going to Sheikh Google. And they were asking Sheikh Google, who am I? How can I be modern and Muslim? And that was tremendously important for me to understand, because what I then could connect as I was doing the work is that we can't be looking at a Muslim in Morocco versus a Muslim in Malaysia versus a Muslim in Norway simply. We needed to understand the demographics, and all of you will understand this because a Gen Alpha is not the same as you, and you are not the same as a millennial. So what's happening with technology and the impact of ideology and belonging, the impact of cultural norms has shifted within demographics, and that idea of Muslimness, whatever that might want to mean to any of us. Now, in addition to that, we have some other things that are going on that are complex for people who are navigating this idea of what it means to be Muslim. I mentioned the fact that I am Muslim, and I can only talk about what it means to be Muslim for Farah. I can't talk about what it means to be Muslim for somebody else. But one thing I do know about being an American and being Muslim, there's no one definition of what that means. Our history in this amazing country is so important to the conversations that we're having around being an American Muslim today. We did not start with 9/11. We did not just start, yesterday talking about a presence of Islam in America. Islam was here before America was America. Islam came to this country with enslaved people before we were a nation. And so there is a very rich and very important history that people often forget about Black Americans and that experience of being Muslim and being Black in America before it became something that was connected to terrorism or anything else. That's a piece of this. Another piece of that landscape nationally is what happened in 1979. And the hostage event with Iran. For young people in graduate school today, or even in college, you weren't on the earth to actually experience what it felt like in the United States, where people were not talking about Islam as a religion, or is that person who's your friend or your doctor or your neighbor, is that person Muslim? You weren't thinking about it that way. The 1979 changed all of that. There was a suspicion that suddenly started easing its way into the American psyche about, can you really trust these people? Look at what's happening in Iran. Look at what they've done with our hostages. can we really trust? And who are these people? And I think, Kian, that is extremely important.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, that allows us, I think, to take the conversation. And before we bring it back to the United States, which I think I want, I will definitely pick that up in terms of being Muslim in the US. But you touched on the idea that as you traveled internationally, you saw this resurgence of the question, which, and this is controversial in academia, that the way that was framed, very importantly by Samuel Huntington and his idea of civilizational differences. So, he also wrote a book called "Who Are We?" And so his idea was that this was the pressing issue and question. My question is, how did you, as you traveled the world, and of course in the US, but how did you see Muslims around the world respond to this idea of civilizational differences? Because as you said, they were struggling with trying to define themselves. I mean, not necessarily leading to a clash between the Muslim world and other regions, but how did you see that framing play out?
Just curious, how many people here have read The Clash of the Civilizations? Okay, this was in Foreign Affairs, which is where it really took off. It was a book also, right?
Yeah, and it was the article was in 1993. The book came out in 1996.
Really important. I think about moments where there is a real intellectual shift in the way people think about things, and that's one of them. I was a graduate student. I just started my first year at the Fletcher School in 1993 when that article came out. And it was unbelievably controversial, obviously. There are some things in the article that were interesting, and I strongly suggest you read it. You provoke yourself. I mean, you learn about what he was saying. The pieces about culture, I think, are very interesting. Yes, culture matters. Headline for policy people, culture matters. And we don't use culture enough as we think about policy. But the premise here was that somehow, if you are from an ecosystem that is somehow Islamic, that there was going to be a problem with what the West stood for. And that's a problem. This idea that democracy and Islam are not compatible. This idea that there is an us and a them, and the us is so much better than the them. And you need to know that that even though intellectually we understand how diverse Islam is, there are some real big problems with the way in which we need to, like, all of that was put on the table with this piece, and it became, I think, foreshadowed how Al-Qaeda wanted you to understand the problem. Al-Qaeda's narrative, of course, was that the West was at war with Islam. Huntington's article actually helped that. It helped to say,
Iranian regime,
yes,
my
exactly,
country.
exactly. It helped that. So you now have a momentum building where people are asking the question, are these people even able to be in America? Because what do they follow? You can see the beginnings of the foreshadowing of the crazy Sharia craziness in the United States right now, where people don't even understand the term, but will decide to use it. You begin to see that, I used the word suspicion before, but there's also this distrust, right? This deep distrust. You cannot have societies that distrust each other. And what this article did was cement the idea that an intellectual was talking about this grand change that was going to happen civilizationally, and that beware, it's coming. And then you see the expectation follow through with the way in which policymakers, and to this day, I will say, as somebody who is a former diplomat, we have got to talk about everybody with dignity and respect. And this idea of there are people who are more civilized or more sophisticated cannot enter into the way in which we approach a region of the world, certainly not a religion, certainly not large components of any society. So all of this is connected in my mind, Kian. I think very strongly that had had this article not been written, we would still have these kinds of things happen, this conversation about, is Islam compatible with democracy?
Right,
Can
that's the
Muslims-
question
Yeah,
I wanted to ask
I
you.
do think.
How do you deal with that? How do you deal with that underlying, let's say, thesis? And how did you encounter that in your travels? And how do you think we as a campus and academic community should deal with this suggestion that there's some kind of contradiction or incompatibility between Islamic norms and Western democratic norms?
Well, let's be very clear about a couple of things. One, of course, Islam and democracy are compatible. There are Muslims that live in democracies all over the world. I am not an Islamic scholar, so I'm not going to get into the nuances of how one is supposed to live in majority countries and the way in which you conduct yourself. But abiding by the law of the land is the way to go. And Muslims clearly are capable of doing that in the United States, in other parts of the world that are democracies. We also have to debunk this idea of sort of the civilization, or I should say, the sophistication of Muslims. You did not use that word, but I'm going to. What I heard from many, many different communities throughout the world is that many people talk about, many non-Muslims talk about Islam as though it is uncivilized, as though somehow these are barbarians, that somehow there is nothing there in the culture that is worth exploring. Then you see the response with many Muslims screaming about, but we did this and we did this and we did this. They're reacting to the narrative that there's nothing to show in Islam. I would say to you that even in 2024, you are still seeing this this expectation that people have to prove. They have to prove somehow that they are capable of being sophisticated, following the rules of the land, of conducting themselves. And I find that really problematic, obviously, because we have to get to a place here in the United States and in any conversations that we're having about not putting people into these hierarchies of which is the most sophisticated religion. It is very obviously demeaning, but it is also dangerous, because what it does is it sets into the ecosystem a set of norms that dehumanize people, that make them feel less respected, that make them feel like they don't belong. And it is not just about Muslims, by the way. We can be talking about people who have a different religion, people who are male, female, who have a different gender, a different race. This happens in many, many different ways. If you are setting yourself up for a conversation about policy, I would also say to you that as we look at different parts of the world, one of the things that I think is really important as Americans is that we are making sure that we are talking about nations with as much respect as we can, and not use language or not have any kind of I don't know, a type of patina on the way in which we talk about things that underscore this idea that you're not as good as we are.
Right. I mean, I think those are really important points. I think it's very important to reiterate for our students and for everyone that there are multiple interpretations of what Islam can look like in politics. And I always say there is an Iranian cleric who was exiled actually from Iran for making the claim that modern human rights is entirely compatible with Islamic Sharia.
Yep.
And he is a qualified jurist, he's a mujtahid, and so when a mujtahid basically says this, it is an acceptable interpretation for Muslims to follow if they so wish. So
You reminded me of something, if you don't mind.
No, please.
Al-Azhar, which is the oldest Islamic university in the world, it's in Egypt. You will remember after 9/11, the head of Al-Azhar talked about the compatibility of following the norms of the land. He was putting down the gauntlet to say what this terrorist organization is describing as Islam is not Islam. And let me remind you that we as Muslims are diverse, and began to follow out, and that was extremely important. But like any other religion, you don't wake up every day and listen to what the Grand Sheikh has to say. You see what's happening within culture and you begin to adapt. And I think one of the things that's really important in terms of what you said about that diversity of what Islam is that, I'm bringing this back to America now for a moment, we are the most diverse group of Muslims anywhere on planet Earth. And we do not talk about that enough. It is so important that when we talk about American Muslims, you are not you, but one does not make a statement and suggest that everybody is that thing. You and I come from different parts of the world originally, heritage-wise. That doesn't mean that we are aliens to be in America, that we are not living out our lives as Americans who also have a heritage that is different. It is where we are getting very, American society has become extremely closed to this idea of accepting different paths of people living their lives the way they wish to as Muslims and being Muslim as they want to be Muslim.
Right. So I think that's a good point where we can turn to some of the trends and events going on in the United States, in America. So, and I'd like to focus that and bring it to there. So a few weeks ago, Muslim groups refused an invitation for an iftar at the White House, and instead demanded a meeting with the Biden administration to discuss the Gaza crisis. The White House appeared caught off guard by this. Were you surprised by this sequence of events? And what lessons do you think we can draw from what happened in this event? And what does that really tell us about what's going on in the United States?
I was not surprised. I take a very different kind of view in this as somebody who was a political appointee for 3 presidents, both Democrat and Republican. I look at the trajectory of the engagement of American Muslims with policymakers first. And I think and I don't know how familiar you are with that sort of longer tail. And I think it's worth spending just a moment to put things in context, because this did not happen out of context. And if you look at the waves of I talked about the fact that America is the most diverse group of Muslims anywhere in the world. But I also want to say that that the way in which American Muslims, no matter which group you come from, approached policy, it's evolved over time. And you were not seeing American Muslims engaged in the way politics or policy. Now, it's very recent that we begin to monitor and make a list of people who are foreign service officers or civil servants who self-identify as something. 50 years ago, 60 years ago, people were not. So it is, I get very nervous when somebody says, I am the first person who's ever done whatever. And I think, are you? Do we know that for sure? So I want to say that for sure, there were different kinds of Americans that were foreign service officers and diplomats and policymakers. In the recent past, I certainly know from the Reagan administration, Shireen Tahrir Keeley, in the Bush administration, Zal Khalilzad, Muslims who were in very senior positions in government. But you weren't seeing the kind of expectation from parents who are Muslim to have their children go into policy or politics. This is a more recent phenomenon. They were going into professions that were different than that. So now you're in a post 9/11 world, you begin to see American Muslims saying, now, wait a minute, why are we on the outside? How do you get that job in policy? How do you begin to how do you do a SIPA degree and then go off and work at the Department of State or run an environmental program or, talk about nukes? How do you do that as a Muslim? And so the beginning pieces about 25 years ago, where 23 years ago, you began to see young Muslims began to put their foot into the policy world, the politics world, going onto the Hill and working there, working in the executive branch of government, beginning to think about how they use their legal degree to maybe do something in public service. By the time the Obama, and that's important because there was not a sophisticated machine in America of either advocacy groups or people that were being trained to be policymakers who were Muslim. And by the time the Obama and when 9/11 happened, that sort of antenna went up, like, we can do more. How do we do more? How do we get our voice known? How do we get into policy? So there was an advocacy component, and then there was also a, I want to be on the inside as a public servant component. Obama was able to surge interest for a lot of different reasons that we don't have all the time to get into today, but that interest was surged. So now you began to see more people trying to figure out, oh my gosh, there's such a thing as a political appointee. I want to do that. I want to be in civil service. I want to be in the foreign service. I want to take my skills and be in the public sector in different ways because I want to affect policy. You also saw the beginning of reorganization and a reawareness from advocacy groups to say, listen, we can learn from other advocacy groups. How do we get our voice known? What does it mean to lobby in a really sophisticated way? How do we think about engaging with the White House or the State Department or the Department of Homeland Security or Commerce, whatever it has to be? So that sophistication started to build. Now we're in an era where things are very, very different. There is money around organization. There is a definite pattern to the way in which people are approaching young people to say, hey, you want to be part of this NGO that's doing this and activating for our point of view? We want to be able to start that campaign or do this campaign. All of this is important. And it's important because we are now seeing the 2% of our American, about 2% American Muslims energized in a very different way. And I think we're going to see Gen Z activated even more than millennials were. And I think we're going to see for a Gen Alpha today, they're going to see in the opportunity to serve in the State Department, the White House, run for office in a very different way. Why is all that important? It's important because today, as we're seeing the post-October 7th climate, you are seeing the years of work being demonstrated. You're seeing how all of this work over time of organization, of becoming more sophisticated, of learning how to lobby, how to use your voice, how to organize, being executed in a different way. So I wasn't surprised when there was a response about the iftar. There is going to, in my view, I think you're going to see more and more American Muslim groups being born because the ones that have been around for a really long time, from the 50s and 60s, were immigrants that came and looked around and said, I don't see anybody who's like me, and I want fellow Muslims with whom I can socialize, go to mosque, do all these kinds of things. We've moved from that to young people looking around saying, look, I really care about the environment, and I think that there's a way we can look at this. Let's create a group of people who are Muslim who care about the environment. We're going to do it this way. So that's where we are in America at this moment.
Yeah, you make a very interesting distinction between a increase in the professionalization of Muslims entering into public life and into senior positions and to positions of influence. But there's another trend which I'd like you to speak to, and that is outside of, let's say, the professionalism, and that is the political mobilization.
Yes.
And so we saw this in the Michigan primary,
Yes.
where a majority of Arab Americans voted none of the above.
Yes.
So this is another area, it seems. But could you speak to how you think this increased presence of Muslims in American public life and in professional positions and increased political mobilization, how is this going to impact this idea, the way we deal with anti-Muslim hate? And how is it impacting? Do you think it will exacerbate it in some way? Can it help? How should we use it to help combat anti-Muslim hate?
Okay, so let us talk about anti-Muslim hate, and I'll back into your question. We're in a really serious moment, obviously. There is a surge of hate across the board. This is not just about Muslims. It's not just about AAPI hate. It's not just about anti-Semitism. It's not just about increase in misogyny. It's not, I mean, I could just go on. We are in a really serious moment in America. And the reasons for that are not just one thing or another, it's many things happening simultaneously, including social media, which we can get into. But there's something that has happened to the way people behave with each other. The lack of civility, the lack of the ability to learn how to disagree well. Those skills have not been polished. There is a rage and a reaction component to everything that we do. Do you like this water flat or do you want it sparkly? I can't believe you don't believe, I mean, it's gotten to that place as opposed to learning how to be able to disagree well. And I say that because the social climate has changed, the ecosystem has changed, online and offline, and that makes a difference to the way in which people are responding to the other. Now, the issue of anti-Muslim hate is very serious. I believe it's going to get worse. I think AAPI hate is going to get worse. I know anti-Semitism is going to get worse because we are not seeing enough roadblocks by regular citizens who say we need to change. This is not who we are. I don't have to agree on everything on a foreign policy side. I don't have to agree on everything, but I can learn to live with difference. And I can figure out how to walk side by side with somebody who is different than I am. We are not seeing those roadblocks in society. Policymakers can't be the ones who only put the roadblocks. They can do some things. And if you ask me that question, I have lots of things that they can do. But I haven't seen the surge of society that has said enough already. This is not who we are as Americans. This is not who we want to be. I do not want that 7-year-old to be recruited by Atomwaffen to hate everybody that is not white. But yet it is happening today. So on the question of the rise of anti-Muslim hate, yes, it is rising. I believe it will continue to rise unless we see some guardrails put both on society and in an online space. But I also think that there are tools that are available and accessible right now to reduce hate and extremism in every form that it comes forward. To your question about, do I believe that some of the political strategies that have been deployed are going to activate an increase of anti-Muslim hate? I do not know, but what I can tell you is two really important things. As a foreign policy person, as an American, and as a Muslim, it is extremely troubling that we are in a place where we cannot talk about any of these issues with any kind of understanding of sort of the global components to this. There are Muslims in America that care deeply about many things, and they're not just a one issue Muslim on a foreign policy side. And I mean on the suffering side, what might be happening in one part of the world or not. I think that the way the conversation has happened post October 7th is that the groundswell of reaction is pushing the conversation in a very specific way that I don't think it's going to, that is important to have the nuance of the conversation, but politically I'm talking about. You talked about lessons learned. What we are learning is that we as Americans haven't done enough deep work of understanding the diversity of Muslim opinion in America. We haven't gone deep on understanding the sections by section of our country on how a Muslim who also might be a homeowner, who also might have 3 children, who also might be, all of the different nuances that we have sliced and diced every other community in our country to understand why they vote one way, why they think about another. We've never done any of that with Muslims. So a lesson that we have learned here is that it's turned into a one-dimensional idea of, if you're an American Muslim, politically, this is the only thing you think about. And I think that is a real problem. It may be true that that is a really important component to the way somebody thinks about about why they want to vote for a candidate, perhaps. But there are other issues that actually drive people as well. So I think the problem we're going to have is that if political parties don't do more to understand the nuance across America for these 2% of the population that is American Muslim, to be able to dissect and understand in the way we do the Hispanic population, the Black population, women voters, pick your demographic. We're going to have a problem because we're falsely understanding what motivates them. And I'll finally say, on the issue of policy, if you want on the political side to be heard, we've got to be able to, any group has got to be able to make a case that is driven with options that make sense for the candidates, right? And I haven't seen that kind of sophisticated response to a lot of different issues that are going on, whether it's the Uyghurs, whether it is what's happening in Sudan, any population that is majority Muslim that is suffering. I haven't seen that kind of sophisticated policy conversation yet. And it's going to be interesting to see if that actually happens.
Well, with those very challenging and sobering, and I think, it's a challenge for all of us, with those kinds of challenges ahead of us, I think that we should open the floor to the question and answer. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions and issues that we haven't touched on that will come up in the question and answer. So do we have a microphone there? So please raise your hand and wait for the microphone. And if you would be so kind, just pose a question to our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very nice explanation of the situation. I'm from Afghanistan, so I will ask a question. It might be different for the American, from the American perspective. Whenever I hear this matter in United States or in other Western capitals, mostly the effort is to explain to the Western audience that we need to understand Muslims. We need to know how they're different and all that. I'm also seeing that there is also a problem on the majority side. They also need to understand themselves better, that how they think about minorities. For example, this question of, is Islam compatible with democracy? Is a very biased and a very question rooted in a system of belief. Let's assume China is becoming a power economically. Once they surpass other economic powers, would they have the right to ask Americans that is Americanness or American compatible with economic development or that system? So
I'm not sure I understand.
So the question is,
yeah.
how is the majority group, how do you advise them to understand their own system of belief better so the hate could be addressed through that? Thank you.
It's an important question. I would say something that I said earlier to you about policymakers and our ability to understand nuance of the world and the diversity of communities within. Take your country, for example, Afghanistan. There's not only one dimension to the way in which we think about Afghanistan. Having spent time in Afghanistan when I worked for USAID, I know that. And I know how hard it is to be able to get that nuance back to Washington so that people think about things differently. I don't know the answer to your question. I think it is very easy for people to generalize, because it makes it possible for them to think that they understand an issue. Nobody wants to spend time to get to know a different culture, time to get to know the nuance within a diversity of people that all on paper seem like they're exactly the same. Policymakers aren't spending that time doing that.
Hi, my name's Lulu. I'm a master's student in the Global Thought program here at Columbia. I was really compelled by some of your conversation earlier in the talk about sort of identity and identity for American Muslims specifically in a post 9/11 world. And I think as we've been able to retrospectively look back to that post 9/11 era, there's a clear way that we can see the Muslim identity within America being constructed almost as like a foil or scapegoat for a moment within which American identity experienced kind of an unprecedented level of unity. And so I'm wondering now in this context where post October 7th, it's yet again really kind of a fulcrum moment for that construction of imagined identity, what role you see certainly policymakers, so the White House press secretary or communications advisors, but also sort of the American media industrial complex playing in constructing these sort of opposing identities of Americanness or Muslimness, and certainly making those very diametric and not synergistic with each other.
I love the question. I'm very depressed about where we are today on this. I feel like I've been through this already and I am doing it all over again. That's how I feel. I teach a class at Georgetown on countering violent extremism. And in the beginning of the class, first couple of classes, we go through 9/11, but not from the perspective you would imagine. I show them some footage of, you've seen the footage, but I don't know if you've seen how correspondents have covered it. So you see Peter Jennings and you see Tim Russert and you see others speaking about what's taking place. And you can absolutely hear, and I watch my students, they're your age, I watch them in shock as they watch mainstream, and I no disrespect to these journalists, but there was no sense of what they were saying because it was, it was all the things that you just described. We've made some progress since 9/11. It's not all doom and gloom. At least there's a consciousness that we got to be a little bit more careful. But we all slip into this. And I think I really want to hit this hard with all of you. How we speak lexicon matters. It so matters. And it doesn't matter if it takes more words to describe something so that you are not setting up an us and them. Take those words. And go as broad as you can, as opposed to going as narrow as you can. Be inclusive. And it's not something a commentator or a policy person wants to do. It takes too much time. But we have to do it. That's a lesson that I learned after 9/11. Now, with respect, when I was at Fletcher, everything I learned about, I did international security studies. And we called it the Muslim world, the Muslim world, the Muslim world. And I did that. I mean, my thesis probably has the Muslim world all over it. But as I became in a post 9/11 world, I thought, well, if you're saying Muslim world, what are we saying? We're saying that Muslims live in a special world. Are we doing that? So when Secretary Clinton asked me to be special representative, it was to what? How? What's the title? I said to Muslim communities around the world. Wait, what? How many words do you want to use? What is that? And I said, because we have to give dignity to a Muslim living in a Muslim majority country, a Muslim living as a minority, however they might do that, but also because we do not want to set up an us versus them. Now, sometimes we all slip into that, it's okay, but your mind needs to be exactly what you just described. What can you do as a student, as a teacher, as a journalist, as a writer, to think differently about how you're describing and how you are thinking about who we want to be as Americans? And that's the final part of your question. Who are we as Americans? And the idea that that there's a 1950s definition of American has yet to be, brought down. We're trying to do that. I'm looking at a very diverse group of people. I think that's amazing. That is who we are as Americans. And the more we speak and talk and get out into the world, the more we will show ourselves. And I think that is extremely important.
Okay, well, we only have a few minutes
Oh, my
left.
goodness.
We could take 2 questions if they're very crisp and short. We'll take 2, maybe 3. If you can pose just a question, we'll gather them, and then Farah will have the last word. Please put your hand up if you have a question.
Answered it all.
Oh. Okay. One question? Well, if there isn't a question, we have maybe 1 minute.
Yeah.
I thought I'd give you the last word with a question about how many students are feeling anxious on campuses about their identity as Muslims, or as Lulu, who was one of my best students, articulated so eloquently, that there's this understanding that there is this potential rise in anti-Muslim hate. How would you recommend to students and campus societies to deal with this question of this anxiety that students might face on campus?
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say this is not just on campuses. I think it is all over the United States. There's a fear component, and there is violence that is taking place. It is not just discrimination or unease. There's also violence. So there's a safety issue that goes into play.
Like doxing and the problems like around that.
Yeah, but also, I mean, safety issues. I mean, a knife coming out, real things that have happened. One, and this is obvious, I'm sure Colombia is already doing this, but it is important that you have allies that can be trusted, that you have a way, and you know that if you are feeling something, that you have an outlet that you can engage with, whether it's health services at Columbia, whether it's a professor that you trust, whether it's a friend that I just want to say that out of the gate. But secondly, it is the way in which, and this is beyond the sort of the safety thing and the mental health thing, it is what is the society in which the community in your dorm or wherever that you want to live in, and how do you engage? And I think if you haven't already, not retreating, but actually extending a hand to find people who don't look like you, live like you, love like you, pray like you, whatever it happens to be, and to find a neutral ground, to find a way to build a bridge. And I know that sounds like I'm Pollyanna, and it's like ridiculous, but you cannot live in a state of unease. You must find ways to be able to engage in a safe way with people who are different from you, so that your perspective is taken, that you are able to feel that you are part of a community. And those things take time, my friend. This isn't like, okay, do this next weekend and everything's going to be fine. Colombia itself needs to engage in a different kind of way. I was a student leader when I was in college a million years ago when dinosaurs roamed the earth. And we had racial incidents happening on our college. There was a cross burning at Amherst. I went to Smith. There was a note that was left on a woman of color's dorm room that was violent, disgusting. And we had to, as a campus, had to reconcile this in 1988, okay? And it was I know how hard it took, how much time it takes and how hard it is. But student leaders, people who are peers, everybody that is part of your environment needs to come together and say, these are the principles that we want. This is the way we want to live. This is how we want to do this. And I think the way out of some of this is to have those uncomfortable conversations so that you are building a common bond, a common way forward, as opposed to somebody else is trying to do this for you.
We've been deeply honored to have someone who could speak on multiple levels, from global politics to domestic US politics to campus life and the anxieties facing individuals. So it only leaves me to ask you to join me in thanking Farah Pandith for today's.